Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host and friend, Laura-Lynn Tyler Thompson, host of Laura-Lynn Live. Laura-Lynn, it's good to be back and to talk about all things that are completely shocking to the to the world you came from. I know that the story that I have for you today, I know that whenever I found it as it related to the Branhamite side of things, I couldn't believe it. I took a step back and I looked at this and I thought, there's no way this is real. It's far more interesting than many movies that I have watched. And it connects to you a little bit because of some of the research that I have been doing into your old church. I forwarded you a couple of the newspaper articles. So I thought maybe today we would talk about the significance of those articles that I sent you. I'll throw them up on the screen for the viewers, but then I want to talk about the backstory of what those articles mean.
I love it, John. And, it's just been such an awakening for me and also for my audience. And of course, the many people that share the same background, because we're a few hundred, maybe few thousand strong across the country. And in Canada, it's pretty significant. And then it worked into the States with people that also knew my pastors formerly, Reg Lazelle, and all that took place. And it's actually been fairly life-changing for me. And I think that before you get into the stories, my shock and awe has been, I didn't even really understand who William Branham was. And yet the people that I've been running with in Canada are pretty much Branhamites, and they celebrate him. And as we're realizing what the truth is behind all of it, I'm hoping there's an education, because we need to be more discerning. And one of the things we failed in as Christians is to not be discerning. We're not hearing from the Holy Spirit, obviously, and we need to be hearing him regularly, because he gives us new information here and there about, the spirit with which someone might be doing something. I heard interesting stories from my good friend, Pastor Mike Poulin, and his wife, Jackie, visited us for the last day or so. And just on how, sometimes people have discernment and then they get into sin or something like that, and it goes all sideways. But with what you are sharing, you're enlightening everyone as to the truth and the reality behind this whole movement that you were raised in, as, just with shocking things, and also people that we now know and we don't realize that all of these things had happened. So I appreciate the discernment, and I can't wait to hear your stories. Believe me, I can't wait.
Well, they're a crazy wild ride. I'll say it like that. Whenever you I'm going to give a hypothetical situation here. Take a room filled with 9 really good men with good hearts, good intentions, Christian men who have a Christian agenda, and they're wanting to further the gospel to the world. But with the 9 is one man who is a con artist. And the other men build big ministries, big empires that are literally built upon the foundation that one con artist built. Whenever they figure it out, what do you do? Because you already have a ministry, you already have all of the people who are following you, sending you money, and then suddenly you realize, wait a minute, something's wrong here. What I have come to find out is this is a real situation. They weren't all in the same, like a little room, but they were in massive audiences. And they discovered that one of them, or more, was a complete con artist. And what do you do with this? What happened was many of the men started saying, well, William Branham was a good man until he went astray. Because they had to have figured out at some point that they were conned. And when they did, they started cutting ties and they tried to separate their ministry. But what happened was, because they covered it up instead of openly said, wait a minute, this guy was a con artist, then that ministry, any ministry that was connected to Branham continued and grew and flourished and turned into a wild mess. So in the beginning of all of this, as Branham is going around touring with, we've talked about it before, the levitating boy, and talking about Raymond Hoekstra, he was later known as Chaplain Ray, which we'll get into later in this podcast. But in the early years, I don't know how much we've talked about this, whenever Raymond Hoekstra found the power of attracting crowds of Christians through entertainment with levitating boys, the money became greater than the message. And once he realized the power and potential of the youngster that was allegedly levitating, he actually owned the boy. If you go to my website and you type in David Walker, you can read all the newspapers where the family has to fight to try to get their boy back because he literally had ownership rights of the child. And he did this because the child was making so much money. Well, if you fast forward to what was created by this, you had William Branham, who was healing the sick. You had the boy. The levitation wasn't his main act. He claimed that he had spent moments of time in heaven. And so crowds were coming to listen. Oh, what is heaven like? Tell me what it's like, young child. And so he would spend time telling them what he saw in heaven and then levitate. And then Branham would heal the sick. Well, over time, this shifted, and Branham became the foremost message of the scene of the show. And this developed into, obviously, the latter rain and became the latter rain message. Well, it became to be called the message of the hour. So the cult that I came from, the one, my grandfather's church here in Jeffersonville, we called it the message of the hour. This was the name of the cult. Worldwide, they call it this. So last couple of weeks, I've been digging a little bit into Reg Lazelle and going through articles, trying to piece things together. I don't know when, but soon I will have a site up for Reg Lazelle and some of the research information. But I came across one newspaper article where he is preaching on the coming New Testament church, and in the slogan, under the sermon title, it says, "This is the message of the hour. Don't miss it." So if you consider the fact that Reg Lazelle is in the latter rain movement, he's working with, as we'll get into, people who are key figures working with William Branham, and he's using the verbiage, the message of the hour. This puts him directly within the circle of people who are in the direct influence of William Branham.
Very shocking. And I know when you sent me the screenshots, I was just like, wow, so this really happened?
It did. And another one that I sent you, which I'll throw it up on the screen here, but Raymond Hoekstra, the man who owned the child that was touring with William Branham, he also spent time in Reg Lazelle's church. This was the church on 590 Canby Street, Glad Tidings Tabernacle.
I grew up hearing all about 590 Canby Street. Yep.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So there's a photograph. I'll throw up the newspaper, but they had this nice big photograph whenever Raymond Hoekstra came to visit them. And the date is significant to me because it was 1951. The newspaper article is January 6th, 1951. This is 1 year after the latter rain movement began to believe that a pillar of fire had came down and been captured in a photograph above William Branham's head. And in today's NAR world, you'll find people like Benny Hinn talking about William Branham had a halo above his head. You can find these audio clips out there.
William Branham was preaching, my dear, when a halo appeared over his head, preaching in Louisiana.
What they're referring to is there is a photograph of William Branham where at the top of it there is this beam of light that was captured. And what these guys did, everybody who was in the building, this was the Sam Houston Coliseum, everybody was in the building who saw the stage lighting would have recognized that this is stage lighting. But everybody who bought the book or bought the photographs, it really looks like a halo. It's an effect that is called halation. Whenever they had black and white photographs, if you took a photograph of a light behind a person, it would create this halo effect called halation. And that's what this was. So this photograph was taken in 1950, 1 year before Raymond Hoekstra came to visit the Glad Tidings Church, which means it puts it into the orbit of the halo story, which, as we get into in this episode, it is a crazy wild ride.
Wow. Well, I can't wait to hear this. And I guess you can imagine that if the halo story began to, we didn't have internet, of course, in those days. So I guess one pastor would tell another. And if everybody's sort of in this field of ministers' influence, then you would hear about it and it would become bigger than life.
Absolutely. And it was bigger than life at the moment at which it was captured. When it was captured, it was simply a photograph. It was taken by one of the men was a full gospel businessman, which we've talked about in the last few episodes. His name was James Ayers. And the studio that was hired to take the photographs of the event in the Sam Houston Coliseum was called Douglas Studios. It was named after a young child, I think it was either 13 years old or 14 years old at the time, named Leslie Douglas Ashley. He went by Douglas. And he was the one who, whenever the photographs were taken, he's the one who went back into the room and developed the photographs and touched them up, etc. But you had the full gospel businessman James Ayers, and you had Theodore Kipperman. Those were the two photographers. The event was a debate between William Branham, F.F. Bosworth, who was out of the John Alexander Dowie cult, and it was against a Baptist minister named Best. So they held this big debate, and in the middle of the debate, they took a photograph. It looked like a halo, and in, I think it's this book, Men Sent from God, which was widely published throughout the Latter Rain movement, by Gordon Lindsay, who went on later to found Christ for the Nations Institute. This book was supposed to have the halo photograph on it, but Theodore Kipperman, James Ayers, decided instead they wanted to copyright it because they realized, wait a minute, this looks like a halo. I'll bet I can make some money off this photograph. So they withheld the photograph for copyright. This book got a different picture, and in the Voice of Healing magazine, they announced, we can't use the picture, this book has been held up, but we wanted to use the photograph that was captured in the Sam Houston Coliseum, which later became revered as this halo photograph. So there's a lot of details surrounding the photograph, but as I'm about to get into, the photograph isn't as interesting as what happened next as it relates to the Pentecostal charismatic movement and eventually the NAR.
Wow. Well, I can't wait to hear that. And, as you were talking, I was thinking about some photographs that someone took of me being prayed for. I think it was back in about 2017 in a church, and the lighting, they said it was so unusual because the lighting just kind of shone. There was some kind of lighting artifact, that made it like I was almost looked angelic in the middle of everyone praying for me. And I never took that and, built a ministry on it. But it's interesting what light does. And if you are somebody who is, has that, you have to have a certain car salesman ability. You have to have a certain, there's a certain type of person who's willing to take something that's perfectly ordinary and, just has, something like a lighting, feature and exploit it for their own benefit. And that is the difference between a person that is willing to just preach the gospel at its best and a person that's willing to use the gospel for gain, which is what Jesus spoke against. And that certain personality type that is willing to exploit things and people is what I think we find as a significant part of what William Branham did, unfortunately.
Actually, that's a good segue into where I was headed with this, because of the exploitation. So you had the reason for this debate. The Reverend Best was a defender of, in his mind and his peers, the gospel. And William Branham and F.F. Bosworth were defenders of, in their minds, the quote-unquote full gospel. This meant we believe in the healings, the signs, the wonders, the miracles, etc. I've actually read some of his books and some of his published literature. He believed in divine healing. He just did not believe in divine healers as such. He would always say it, I don't believe in divine healers as such. But he believed that God healed the sick. It's written in the Bible. How can you not believe it? But his debate was, he thought that these men, like William Branham, were exploiting the people and for financial gain, for nothing else but to make themselves rich and famous. So he wanted to debate and challenge them. The debate itself, so picture all of these people, Christian people coming to this meeting. On one side, we have the people who don't believe this divine healing stuff, but does believe in God. They're Christian. Then you have all the Pentecostal, charismatic, before charismatic existed, the Pentecostal latter rain, I should say. They were fighting on behalf of the signs and miracles. It broke out into a fist fight right there in the Sam Houston Coliseum. Christians fist-fighting Christians, and they had to escort them from the building quickly. Even that is not the most interesting thing. So there is a book by Robert L. Bentley called Dangerous Games. And this book was key to unlocking the whole mystery behind all of this story. This book is about Leslie Douglas Ashley after she became a transgender, and she started working in the political party supporting President Clinton and some other Democrats in the Democratic Party. Leslie Douglas Ashley, at the time that this photograph was captured and was involved in capturing it, was a young male prostitute who was likely working the grounds at the Sam Houston Coliseum. So we have a prostitute, and all of that information is detailed in this book. The two men, Leslie Douglas Ashley's, they were the uncle and the stepfather, James Ayers, Ted Kipperman. They were also counterfeiters. So you had a counterfeiter who's working with a prostitute young child who later became transgender. And all of this is surrounding this halo photograph. This is the backstory that probably nobody knew at that time. So back to my original analogy, you had 10, 15 people in the room. They saw all of this thing. They saw the halo photograph. Maybe it's God, maybe not. I don't know. I was there, but I saw stage lighting. But they're saying it's God coming down in a pillar of fire, so I'm going to believe it as a latter-rain minister. That would have been the story that was pitched likely at the Glad Tidings Tabernacle, because it's only about 1 year in advance. But after that book was published, or after the photograph was published, the story ran rampant. William Branham said that this was like the pillar of fire that came down for Moses and the children of Israel. He said this is the same pillar of fire in today's world that is showing us that we're about to escape this world. And he started preaching his rapture theology. So fast forward to the year 1963. William Branham was preaching in Jeffersonville, and he said that God was going to give him the mystery, and he was to go out to Arizona and hunt. He goes to Arizona to hunt, and the second of the two major relics of Branhamism is this mystery cloud. I don't know, have you seen this before, the mystery cloud?
Yes, I have. In Googling things, yes, yeah, I've seen this.
So if you are a Branhamite, and oddly, if you're in the New Apostolic Reformation, or many of its predecessors, these two are the two relics of Branhamism. You have the cloud and you have the halo, and they're both connected in a strange way. When William Branham went out west to hunt and to receive his message from the Lord, whatever it was that he claimed, he arrived in Arizona before hunting season, and Leslie Douglas Ashley, the one who was with the two photographers, was on a 3-day sex orgy. I hate to say that word, but he was in a 3-day sex orgy with a man named Fred Thompson, and shot him. And so he had another prostitute with him. He, the prostitute with him, took Fred Holmes, burned the body, fled the scene, and made the FBI's most wanted list. So wow. this is coming down into a weird setup, because you've got William Branham, who's out to receive a message from God, two prostitutes. How is all of this connected? Well, James Ayers, the man who was a full gospel businessman, the stepfather of the boy, the one who realized that this halo photograph that so many people have taken to be this pillar of fire, he used it as leverage. And he said, William Branham, you have to come help us get Leslie Douglas Ashley off of death row. So at the time that this cloud happened in Arizona, this was the result of a rocket detonation for the missile defense system, which is another story for another day. At the time this happened, Branham was in Houston, Texas, with the full gospel businessmen, with John Osteen. Joe Osteen's father was there with them, and they were setting up a petition to try to stay the execution of Leslie Douglas Ashley. So while all of this is going on, Leslie Douglas Ashley is being taunted as a poster child for a conversion to Christianity, even though he's a transgender prostitute. All of these men are coming together, rallying around him, and there's an audio clip, which I have also on my website, of what sounds very much like a forced confession from Leslie Douglas Ashley.
My testimony I am entitled is called God Provided Me the Road of Salvation. God created man in his image, and according to Romans 12, I have laid before him my life as a living sacrifice, and his will be my life. The route of sin to homicide, to the courtroom, to death row for Jesus for mercy. Jesus Christ is for all, and all is for Jesus Christ.
At the time all of this is happening, all of these men are, at this point, not yet at the point where they believe William Branham has gone astray. They're all rallying around him. But during the course of this meeting, you have to understand that it likely came into their minds that suddenly they're thinking, not much of this story really adds up. Why are we here helping to defend a transgender prostitute who killed a man? Why are we listening to this forced confession? Gordon Lindsay, who again is the head for Christ for the Nations, he publishes in the Voice of Healing magazine the whole event as though this was a conversion to Christ. And we'll get it. I won't get into too far into this, but Ashley later left all of this and became probably completely atheist, did completely have a sex change, and was rallying against most of the political parties that these men support. So if it was a conversion, it didn't last very long. But there came a point that everybody's in the same room together, and they have to realize that man that we're supporting here, he's got to be a con artist.
Unbelievable. And to be a fly on the wall when it kind of begins to sink in, like, what is happening? That is crazy. And you're right. It's like a movie. It's a good Wednesday night, maybe Friday night movie on a series of things that went down. So then what happens?
So after they all started rallying to try to petition for the stay of execution, Branham does come to Houston because he's there when this cloud formation happened. He and John Osteen visited in the prison cell. I think there's either photographs or there's text about it. I think I've got a text article about it.
On the 24th day of May, 1961, I was found guilty of murder after a 9-day trial here in Houston. The all-male jury, consisting of 4 all-over refinery workers, a carpenter, a tree surgeon, a postal clerk, a postman, an estimator for an electric contractor, a retired foundry worker, a salesman, and a millwright for a paper company, assessed the penalty at death. Then following the death penalty, I was transferred from the hospital to death row to a very lonely, cold cell here in the county jail. During the day, I received a visit from a local pastor, Pentecostal, and he asked me, did I know who Jesus was? And my reply was, no, who is he? He explained to me in detail as I listened, and then afterwards he led prayer. Something I believe truly led me how to pray and seek forgiveness. Upon his departure, he presented me with a Bible with certain verses underlined.
They tried to convince the judge and failed. But what happened was they convinced Leslie Douglas Ashley to start claiming that he was Elijah the prophet. And if you know the history of Branhamism and everything leading to Branhamism, through Christian Identity's Malachi 4 theology, they believed that the Elijah of the Old Testament would be restored in the last days, and we would see this Elijah figure again. They also knew that not many people would really believe this, and they would think that Ashley was crazy. So Leslie Douglas Ashley started claiming that he was the return of Elijah the prophet. And he and some of the other guys, and I guess in the Full Gospel Businessmen, started a evangelical foundation for his Elijah ministry. And there was actually a stay of execution for a plea of insanity because he was claiming to be Elijah the prophet. Ashley, after the stay of execution, Ashley escaped the minimum security prison that he was in and hid out, I guess, in the circus as, I think, Bobo the Clown or something. But the FBI, I'll throw this up on the screen. It's kind of funny. The FBI's top 10 most wanted picture has him as a both male and female, and there's a article somewhere that's talking about the FBI agents are looking for a man dressed as a woman, holding a Bible and preaching while dressed as while hiding out as a clown in the circus. It's one of the craziest articles that I've ever came across.
Unbelievable.
But all of this because these Full Gospel Businessmen helped, I guess, convince him to be Elijah the prophet. So here's the poster child for a converted transgender person who converted to the Latter-rain movement, gave their heart to Christ, and has this weird forced confession. Immediately, when the chance opens, escapes prison and starts hiding out and running from the law. So you can tell there wasn't really a conversion there at all.
Wow. And when you're talking about John Osteen, I just want to confirm, this is the father of Joel Osteen, the same?
It is the same one. Not many people know this, but John Osteen, I even have, somewhere I've got articles of him touring some of the Latter-rain churches. He was deeply embedded in this thing that I guess you would call it, even back then, you would still call it the message of the hour. So he was embedded in this. His ministry almost failed, and as I understand it, the Full Gospel Businessmen, the same ones who were working with Branham, offered him a tent ministry and I guess helped establish his ministry when his ministry was failing. So that church that Joel Osteen preaches from today, it exists only because they were part of this movement.
Wow, fascinating. And John was a part of trying to get this guy pardoned.
Right, absolutely.
What they've done. I mean, I'm just so shocked. Like, what was it to them that they all rallied around this person?
Well, that's just it. See, in my mind, I try to think of logically what makes the most sense. And none of this makes any sense. If you really take a step back and think about it, it was almost career suicide for many of these evangelists to try to rally around this person. I very, very cautiously talked about what happened during I did use the O word, but I very cautiously talked about what happened. If you actually read the articles, this was a very nasty, nasty crime. This isn't something that any evangelical minister would ever want to try to help or try to, stay the execution. So it's really odd. I think this is the point at which many of the ministers suddenly realized that they had been conned. It has to have been. because they're in the room with Branham, with James Ayers, these men who knew that the photograph was actually just stage lighting, and that was his leverage over Branham to get Branham to come and headline the stay of execution revivals. So you're in this revival for a transgender person who committed a murder solely to salvage the notion that there was a halo above William Branham's head. So I'm putting myself in their shoes as a minister. I don't know that I could buy this. Even if I was a part of the movement, I don't know if I could buy this, because it literally would have been career suicide. John Osteen had nothing to lose, though, because his whole ministry existed because these men had helped prop it up. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
Why do you think, John, why William Branham would want to see this guy vindicated? Is it because he was associated with him prior? Is that it?
If you read all of the information that exists about these guys are Ted Kipperman, who is the other photographer, went on to create a pawn and wedding shop in Houston. You could go in, you could hawk something and get a ring and suddenly get married in the same building. That's how weird this is. So these weren't really your top Christian guys that he's working with. But my gut tells me that if they knew that the halo photograph was nothing but stage lighting, and we have photographs, I'll throw them up on the screen. You can see other photographs from the same exact era and even later. The black and white ones, it looks like a halo, but you can see the stage lighting behind their heads. There was stage lighting in there. So the photographers knew, but in the latter rain movement, this was a popular photograph. There was a lot of mileage that came from this photograph. And every ministry that was connected to Branham, that was literally, this is the pillar of fire that's vindicating our entire ministries. This is the pillar of fire that came down over the children of Israel, and it's over the head prophet of the latter rain movement, William Branham. I think there's a point at which the men realize that either we admit that the whole thing was a fake, or we go support this. And there had to have been a decision made in their minds before they did this, because again, it's career suicide to come try to get involved with this. So there had to have been a decision within their minds that they're going to cover this up. Yes, we have now figured out the guy had to have been a con artist, but if we expose that, then we expose ourselves. So it's more about protecting themselves than it was protecting the truth.
So the guy on death row, he has shot someone, and he's been with prostitutes, and William Branham wants this guy because maybe he had feigned or said he had come to the Lord, and so they were going to help him. Do you think there was any chance that he, from his prison cell, would be saying, I'm going to out you guys? You either help me or like blackmailed in any way? I'm just trying to think of another angle.
Well, you're talking about two counterfeiters.
Right.
The guys who owned the studios were counterfeiters. I mean, and they had, I've got the legal documents on my website for that. You can see that clearly there was a problem here. These were not very good men that he was working with. I don't know. I go back and forth because if you read the statements that is in the book, Dangerous Games, either they have been paid to cover it up or they legitimately did not know what was wrong with the photograph. Ted Kipperman in the book, he was interviewed and he said that he thought maybe his camera was faulty. And myself, I go back and I look at all of the photographs that are from the era. I don't know that I buy the faulty camera thing, because if you find other photographs that look like halos, which again, I'll throw some up on the screen, he had to have known it was stage lighting.
So odd. And so you think that this was probably the moment in history when people began to go, what is really going on here, that weren't involved in this, debacle. So John Osteen may have had a wake up at that time?
Based off of my research, whenever I put things together into a timeline, you start to see these patterns emerge. Again, I looked at Reg Lazelle's newspaper articles advertising his Sunday sermons, and I see the message of the hour, which binds it to all this. You had the halo photograph in 1950. You have Reg Lazelle, 1951. Then, it's just 1953, I think, is whenever there's a big falling out between William Branham and some of the other ministers. You can start to see signs along the way where there are rifts occurring and there are people who are at odds with each other, and they always seem to come back. The rift that happened in 1953, Branham was to speak in, I think it was Chicago, at one of the Voice of Healing conventions, and they snubbed him. They wouldn't let him speak, and this caused this big schism in the movement. You had people from the leadership in the movement in Chicago that are fighting with Gordon Lindsay, very verbally. You can see it in their magazine articles. So you had these rifts that are forming all along the way. And whenever something like this happens, if you get on one side or the other of the debate, you're going to think critically. And that's really the key to unlocking all of this. If you take a step back and think critically about any of it, you're going to say, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't even resemble Christianity. So if you start to notice when people are having these shifts and these differences of opinion that are major, significant enough to publish in a magazine, you have to know that they had some inside knowledge as to those people that they agreed with and those people that they thought were complete scoundrels. The fact that Branham was snubbed in 1953, which is 2 years after this was taken, it tells me that there were people, at least in 1953, who realized that's not a pillar of fire. This is not something from God. Otherwise, why would you snub him? Why would you let the messenger for the hour stand back and not be a speaker, right? So I have to believe that all along the way, there were people who knew. I don't think everybody knew. I think that there were a lot of people who just bought it because they were told. Like Reg Lazelle, I have no reason to think that he was bringing these men into his church because he thought they were scoundrels. He probably believed they were good men, but he also didn't have all the information. Whenever you go through a trial of this significance, this was a nationally publicized, crazy trial from a guy who's back then transgender was not so common as it is today. This was highly offensive to many of the people of that era. And to make the FBI's most wanted list, this was nationally publicized. So I think during the course of that trial, so much information had to have come out that these men had to have critically thought. So in my opinion, which it's all just opinion, I think they had to have known. They had to have been, at this point, they had to have awakened and realized this isn't right. Something here is not right.
Something here is not right. And, down through the ages, I think what we're getting to and why God is flipping the tables right now, and even you coming out of this in 2012 and your journey to bring light and exposure to the truth. This is the hour where God has suddenly released a lot of information through internet, through podcasters such as yourself and myself, so that people like, I was just listening to a broadcast of Rick Joyner still trying to promote someone like Todd Bentley or Jim Baker. He brought him back, and I heard recently Jim is feeling like he's, going bankrupt, I guess, selling the end days food, and these electrical, you have a backup generator. Make sure you have your backup generator for the end of the world and all that. I guess it's not, everything is being exposed for the nonsense that it is. And like I was discussing Bob Jones this week with a couple of people. Here's a guy who, I guess he had some words, prophetic words that came true. He said some things, but he used his prophetic gifting to get women to disrobe in his office or wherever he did these prophetic words. And you have to then wonder, like, God is watching. Where is the fear of the Lord? And when I see what shenanigans William Branham did, and these other men that were with him, where was the fear of the Lord? It's no wonder in 1953, hopefully, some serious lovers of the truth of Jesus Christ began to say, yeah, buddies, this far and no further. We're not supporting this anymore.
Absolutely. And Bob Jones is another one who was a strong defender of William Branham. And he, if you study the IHOP history, International House of Prayer in Kansas City, they basically reinvented Branhamism in Kansas City with this movement. Paul Cain being one of the biggest supporters, Bob Jones also. What's really odd, so I mentioned the cloud photo, the cloud photograph that's in this magazine. So when this happened, William Branham was in Houston, Texas, defending the transgender person. Everybody was with him. Everybody knew he was there. Everybody who's part of this movement rallied around him, gave their support. It's published in, the Voice of Healing magazine. Everybody who reads the magazine knows that he's there. Well, he goes back to Arizona for his hunting trip after this has came and gone. Goes back to Jeffersonville, Indiana, and somebody hands him this magazine. He mentions it on recording that after, I think he preached like 10 sermons, and somebody handed him this. And he said, I was there. I was right under this thing. And this is a photograph of 7 angels coming down from the heavens to give me the mystery behind the 7 seals of Revelation. That's why this hangs in everybody's church who's in this, churches or homes that are in this movement. So Paul Cain, who's big into instrumental in helping create many ministries and connections within the NAR. Bob Jones, who was a strong supporter of Branham, who also helped establish the Kansas City Fellowship, etc. They are promoting a man who was lying through his teeth. And I have to believe Paul Cain would have known many of these things. Anybody who's reading the magazines and puts the timeline together, there has to be a point when you recognize something's not right here. Whenever I was growing up in this, I knew all of the events. I never thought about them in the form of a timeline, and I had no idea that the reason why he was in Houston, Texas was because of the transgender person who committed a murder. I remember William Branham talking about helping stay the execution, and he said, this sounds crazy, but he said it, and we oddly believed it. He said that the Humane Society gave him an Oscar for his performance in helping stay that execution. And now me looking back as a grown adult man, thinking back to just that statement in itself is so absurd. You can tell that there's a mental health problem here. This man has a mental health issue. But there are adults in the ministry who are still preaching it. And they're preaching it, in my opinion, they're covering up all of this past because their ministries, their entire empires are built on top of this. I'm certain that they're aware of many of these details, but if they admit, wait a minute, this guy was a con artist, well, what parts of your ministry were built on top of his foundation? And you have to start taking everything down. Eventually, it's a house of cards.
Yes, eventually it is. And do we have any understanding of why why this guy was murdered? Like what happened? What the reason was?
Yes. And if you read this book, it will tell you all of the graphic and gory details. Because this podcast goes out on YouTube, I can't give too much information, but
wow.
The to put it
that
in
bad.
To put it in a G-rated, well, it's not even G, but to put it in a way that YouTube can play it. There were 3 people involved. 2 of them were prostitutes, and they, in the course of what they were doing, a gun was part of their fun.
Okay.
And I'll leave it at that. You can let
and the gun went off.
You can let your mind wander.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So we get the picture. So my goodness, what a story. So when Jeremiah talks about the wicked, how wicked our human hearts are, and beyond all believability, this is really what we've seen in the life and times of William Branham and, and others since him that are just, I think, using the gospel for their own gain. And there is fraud, lies, deception, murder, the strangest of things. And what's weird is it involved people in and around them that got bigger names like John Osteen. I mean, probably very few people know Reg Lazelle. That's a personal name, very well known to me because he was the senior pastor of the church I grew up in until he turned it over to Maureen Glardy. But these men were all running in these same circles, I guess, because the big meetings were happening and people were saying, oh, this is maybe Elijah come back or whatever. And even at his death, at William Branham's death, I think you said that somebody, made this, this quote that, we have seen Elijah through his life or whatever, something to that effect.
For me, the moral of the story is this. It all goes back to that article that I shared with you where Chaplain Raymond Hoekstra ties all this together. So Chaplain Raymond Hoekstra, who owned the child who's levitating, who's touring with William Branham, Chaplain Raymond Hoekstra, the reason he has this title is because he earned a title of being a prison ministry for helping this Leslie Douglas Ashley. He was there with Branham. He was part of this entertainment thing. And that's solely what it was. It was entertainment. The moral of the story here is whenever you try to build something that isn't the gospel, something that is solely for the purpose of entertainment, entertainment does attract crowds, it does attract money, but it is not the gospel. And that's what they were presenting, this form of entertainment with levitating boys, with halos, with whatever it is. The men who are behind it, like Raymond Hoekstra, he had to have known that this boy truly couldn't levitate. You have to know this, right? You have to know that the transgender person did not convert to Christianity. It's very obvious that he didn't. But in spinning it in such a way that it sounds entertaining to a crowd, it brings in money. It does bring in money. The problem is, if you never admit to it and you continue that theme, entertainment gets boring. So you have to get bigger, you have to get better, you have to get more entertaining, more tricks, more stage personas. And that's really why we have the NAR today. If you follow it, if you trace it all the way back through all of this, it isn't that everything is built on William Branham, even though he was a key part of this. It's the entertainment that they were focusing upon, not the gospel. And as you grow that entertainment, you turn into a solid mess.
And I feel like, John, that's what I've been highlighting here in Canada with Sean Feucht. You know, I've taken some real hits from my Canadian audience because they're like, what is wrong with you? Because I had big worship events during the COVID years outdoors. We gathered to worship. But Sean Feucht comes here and he's shut down, and they say he's being persecuted because he's MAGA, and he's being persecuted because of his policies or opinions on LGBTQ. And the thing is, so just today, he has a picture of a person from that group, and they have a sign. And Sean Feucht's words is basically, we have to open up the mental institutions as soon as possible so that we can get this, I guess, wacko, put in there. And I just was like, people need Jesus. Is this how Jesus would try to convert the sinners? Is call them mental cases and come out against them? And so when Sean Feucht shows up in Canada and he has smoke bombs thrown at him, he is now disallowed in Winnipeg. And I think the latest is no churches will have him in Winnipeg, the Manitoba area. The churches won't have him now. And he'll go on to his social media saying, like, Canada's shut down, they're communists, they're not allowing worship. Not true. In the same city where he was in Montreal and gets the smoke bombs thrown at him, which he called fire bombs initially, which was not a firebomb. So he had to kind of go, oh yeah, walk that back a bit. Oh, it's just a smoke bomb, purple smoke bomb. Quite different than a firebomb. But now when he's not allowed in all these cities, he's saying that, it's Canada. But in actuality, in Montreal, they had this huge worship gathering in downtown Montreal, everyone singing worship, no smoke bombs, no police, no Antifa, nobody protesting, because it's really about Sean Feucht. And trying to get this message across has been really difficult. Like, the discernment is really at a low level. And I think that's how we got here. People, thank God, began to discern William Branham, but look how long it has taken for truly coming out of this man, to the point where the people in Canada that have been doing Battle for Canada, Art Lucier, Steve Holmstrom, Dean Briggs, all of these guys, Mark Brisbois, man, they're just all about William Branham. And they don't even investigate. They have been trained into a way of thinking. And our discernment needs to come up at this hour.
Exactly. There has to be a point in which people stand up for what's right. And I think that there were people who, after all of this played out, there had to have been some of the men and women who were in those meetings and saw what happened, that they did wake up. Sadly, most of them woke up silently and they just walked away. There needs to be more people who speak out whenever something is wrong. You have to put a stop to what's wrong, or you're part of it. And I feel that those who went on to build their ministries on top of this and say that God's generals, William Branham is one of God's generals, but he went astray at the end. If you really understand what that means, it means that you're supporting a con artist through the first part of his ministry, saying that that was one of God's general. It's only whenever it starts to look like it might affect my own ministry when you say he's turning astray. But he was always like this. No matter what era you look at, it was always the same thing. It's just they were about to get caught.
And just to reiterate something that, you enlightened me to, but just for new members of the audience who might not have seen our last few podcasts, but William Branham was in the hospital often for mental health issues and having nervous breakdowns and things like that, just totally, being covered up. He was not well much of the time.
No, he was not. In fact, one of the mythologies of William Branham is that he got attacked by a demon squirrel. He starts talking about being in this mental health episode, and I think it was Mayo's clinic that he was going to, but he starts talking about how he was attacked by a demon squirrel. The problem is, I am very sympathetic to mental health issues. I think people, you can't help it. There are people who just need help, and I'm sympathetic to it. But the people that I know of who do have issues, whenever they're in an episode, I will never think that that episode is something that's sent from God. And if they claim that they see a vision during the episode or whatever it is, you have to really question that. And again, you look at some of the men that were involved in this mess, they had to have known. First off, they had to have known that they were being conned, but they also, when you're around somebody who has mental health issues, it doesn't take long before you sense it. And the men and women who were in the inner circle who began to realize that this guy's just a little crazy, they had to have known, they had to have understood it. But whenever you're looking at a crowd of 10,000 people, and they all came to see the guy who you know has this issue, it's very difficult to step up and say, it's not right, I'm not going to be a part of this. And it really comes down to character. You had people of character who left and said, I want no part of it. But you had other people who I question their character because they continued it.
Wow, that is such a good point. And was there anyone who, okay, in 53, you're saying that, they didn't want him preaching. Do you know of anyone who out loud was saying something is wrong here? Do you know of anyone like that at that time? Going against the Branhamites?
Well, that's our story for another day, because that led up to directly to a tie into Jim Jones. There was a point at which, I doubt it was as many as Branham said, but there was a point at which hundreds of ministers stood up and said, we want no part of this, over one of the key doctrines that Branham had introduced. Jim Jones took the side against Branham, and it all began with this rift that I talked about in 1953. That began to escalate, and by 1950, I think it was 1956, it went very explosive, and numerous people who were in the developing what would develop into the charismatic movement, numerous people were prophesying Branham's death because he was outright heretical. And after he died and he was venerated as God's general, they seem to have erased that history too. So next time maybe we can talk about that.
Let's do that. John, it's always so fascinating. Thank you for what you're bringing to light. I thank you personally. And I know that I keep getting emails and such that people are being so awakened and enlightened by the information you're bringing, because it's actually truly very unique to your life. And it impacts our lives. And you're just doing a great job. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I know that you take heat for it, and there's backlash against you spiritually and personally, but you're doing what is right. And I have such respect for you. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I don't know that I deserve it, but I appreciate it. If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org and Laura-Lynn Live. For more about the dark side of the New Apostolic Reformation, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.